So I'm sure you all know why you're here. Tonight we're going to kick off this summer teaching series on apologetics. So when I was new to being a Christian, whenever I heard the term, I thought that Christian apologetics meant that there was this group of Christians, and I've said this before, some of you probably heard it, but it's true. But I thought there was this group of Christians going around apologizing for things that other Christians had done. Right? Like they were apologizing for the Crusades, or they were apologizing because this megachurch pastor had fallen into sin. I didn't know what they were apologizing for, but that's what I thought apologetics was all about. That's not what it is at all, I found out. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us this. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. So the Greek word that's translated there as defense or to give an answer is apologia. So apologia is where we get the word apologetics, which then could be defined as the methodology of defending the Christian faith. So that's what we're going to talk about. Apologetics isn't necessarily a deep dive Bible study. What we're going to be talking about is really how to give a defense of the things that we believe. And so we're going to dig into what I have gathered to be the main objections to Christianity. I'll be up front. The reason that apologetics kind of gripped me, especially early on, was not really so I could just immediately jump in and destroy, unbelievers or Muslims or Mormons or anybody else. It was really because I was very skeptical myself. I had all of these questions, and I thought to myself, well, if God really exists and all of these things are true, then he needs to have an answer for all of these things. And he did. So that's why apologetics is still dear to my heart, because, that was how I basically came to trust God fully, because he answered every single question that I had. Sometimes I think we wish that the answer was more detailed. I guess I need to add this caveat too. But the answers, although they might not be as in-depth as we want them to be, they're always logical, they're always consistent, and we can kind of see God's character in the answers that he gives to us all of the time. I can't say that I have a bunch of experience successfully evangelizing people from other belief systems necessarily. I've had some conversations along those lines, but mostly over the past several years, it's been with other believers that have had or struggled with those same types of questions. So as I've shared what I've learned with them, a lot of them have commented that it would be great if I would have an apologetics class similar to the apologetics that I teach here at the school for adults. So that's why we're here. I thought that it was a great idea. And we're not going to be able to obviously possibly cover every single criticism that anybody has against Christianity. But like I said, I picked the 6 or 7 main topics that I see, and then 3 or 4 points that fall under each one of those topics. So if you didn't get a schedule, it's online, and I'm sure we'll be posting that again. But each week we'll cover a different topic with 3 or 4 points underneath. I think everyone got kind of a summary sheet there. Obviously, what we're going to be going through is going to be a lot more in-depth than what's there, but I wanted to have something for you to take home. And if you want to take notes as we go through it, feel free to do that. So the one thing I want to reiterate probably every week is when we talk about apologetics and we talk about having dialogues and conversations with other people, I have found it incredibly helpful to keep in mind to ask questions of the other people. So most people have not really analyzed why they believe what they believe. Christians or from any other belief system, atheists, humanists, it doesn't matter. Most people walk around just kind of assuming that what they've been told or taught by parents or grandparents or teachers is the truth. And it doesn't really go any further than to analyze why they believe what they believe, and is it actually true? And so a lot of times when we ask them questions, it exposes the faultiness of their belief, or kind of forces them to analyze what they say they believe. And I have found, at least, that it's a lot easier and yields a lot better results when you lead them to seeing the inconsistencies in what they say they believe, rather than you standing there and saying, you're wrong, I'm right, right? Asking questions kind of lowers the defense, I guess, and it leads to a lot better conversations. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is defending objections about truth. So in John chapter 18, Pilate is interrogating Jesus, and Jesus tells him the reason he came into the world. Jesus says he was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. And Pilate retorts to him, what is truth? I think basically what Pilate is saying is, I don't even know that truth exists. So you have Jesus saying, I am the truth, and everyone who believes in truth listens to me. And you have Pilate saying, well, no one can even prove that truth exists, Jesus. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of people who still respond to the truth claims of Christianity the same condescending way. You're going to tell me what truth is? I don't even think anybody can tell me what truth is. The same way Pilate responded to Jesus, there's still a lot of people that have that response to Christianity. And the enemy has used philosophical arrogance, I guess is the best phrase that I can put on it, to gain a foothold in the minds of a lot of people, right? And he's been able to undermine the truth of the gospel before a lot of people even really consider the implications of their beliefs or of Christian beliefs. So when we do apologetics, sometimes we're on the defense, right? Sometimes people are attacking Christianity. But it's actually a great strategy if we can get on the offense to ask people and engage people with what they believe, right? Aim to have conversations in love, obviously, but when you ask most people to define and defend their worldview, well, a lot of times they don't even know what a worldview is. But if we go beyond that, they really can't. The systems that the enemy has used, especially in this country, to indoctrinate the masses are intentionally anti-Christian, really, if you analyze them and look at them. And because of this, millions of people have been taught to believe, and they have believed, that there are these gaping holes in Christianity. And they haven't ever even actually taken the time to sincerely, again, analyze the truth claims of Christianity, because that's just what, again, their parents, grandparents have told them. That's what the school systems told them. That's what they heard at college if they went to college, that there's these gaping holes in Christianity, and they just take it for truth and never analyze it. And so obviously that's going to apply to every single topic that we'll cover, but can't be more applicable than to the topic of truth itself. So the first point that we're going to go through here is the claim that given enough time, all truth can be known. So that's what's known as rationalism. Given enough time, people will investigate and explore, and we will eventually be able to know everything that there is to know. So if we don't have a good definition and understanding of the truth, it's hard to understand why God's word even matters. It might sound strange, but we need to talk about the history of philosophy, actually. So stick with me for a bit as we go through this. So maybe you've heard names like Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, John Locke, David Hume, Karl Marx, others in that list. I definitely remember learning about them whenever I was in high school. I don't remember exactly what I learned or what they did or what they were known for, but I remember the names. And they were always portrayed as incredible thinkers, right? Their work just left this indelible mark and this positive impact on society. That's what I remember being taught. Looking back, I'm a little bit curious why there weren't other names in the list, like Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or Soren Kierkegaard. These are all philosophers, but they were Christian philosophers, right? We didn't get to learn about them. I'm actually not that curious. I understand why we didn't learn about them. So when I talk about the government school system that we have, I'm not condemning teachers or anybody that works there. I've been very outspoken about our public school system, but I don't ever want anybody to feel condemned. I know we got a lot of great teachers and administrators or whatever else in our church family. But when I talk about it, I talk about the system. Because the government-regulated school system as a system is not neutral. even though they claim to be neutral. Like we just talked about, the philosophers that I at least learned about in high school, you can clearly look, and once you start to analyze, it's not neutral. It's not neutral at all. When you look at even the formation documents of our school system, the founders actually of our public school system were outspoken about their desire in starting our school system. Their desire was to literally rid the population of Christian thinking. It's in the foundational documents, and also in other writings and different things that you can dig up and read. That was the main point to start the public school system. And when you look at how that has played out over the last 150, 200 years, you can see that they pretty much accomplished what they had set out to do. Their definition of impartial or neutral really just means we're going to remove God. They operate consistently, actually, within a doctrine of a different religion called humanism, which is, as wild as it might sound, a recognized and protected religion by our government. Humanism is. There's no neutral, right? Every teaching system is based in a religious belief. Humanism's a religious belief. Atheism's a religious belief. Everyone has a religion because you can't not have a religion. You can't not have a worldview. Every teaching and every doctrine is based in some type of worldview or religion. Nothing is neutral. You're either for God or you're against God. There's no gray area. So whenever we look at the history of thinking, which is basically what philosophy is, we can divide history into three main categories, at least here in the West. So the first category is pre-modernism, the second is modernism, and the third, which is where we are now, postmodernism. So pre-modernism. We can't pinpoint an exact date when the majority philosophy of thought took root, but this time period lasted from antiquity, all the way in biblical times, up until somewhere around the 1800s. You can kind of see seeds starting to form in the 1700s, but it really took root in the 1800s. Pre-modernism looked to God, capital G, or gods, lowercase g, for truth. So before the 1700s, that's where people looked for truth. Now, they might have had the wrong God. They might not have had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's God, our God. And the Bible obviously has a lot to say about people that got it wrong. But nearly everyone believed that there was some type of supreme, supernatural being, some type of spiritual authority, and objective truth was determined by them, whoever they believed them or God was, right? But then in the 1800s, all of this began to change. People began to become more and more suspicious of religion, more and more suspicious of spirituality, and driven by certain segments of culture, specifically art and literature, the creatives, right? The prevailing philosophy on truth and human existence switched, and that's where we get into that second category of modernism. Another term used for this period of history is the Age of Reason, if you remember learning anything about that. So essentially, rationalism, or reason, what humans could study and explain, became the authoritative source of truth. If we know it and we can explain it, then that's what's true, not what God said to be true. It's actually a fascinating study. There's all kinds of books, and on the back of the printouts that I have, I'll always include some resources that I have found very helpful. But it's an incredible study to understand the reasons behind all of those things shifting. And we don't have time to go through all of the reasons tonight, but suffice it to say that this marked a major change in world history. One where the developed world, the educated world, right, departed from a foundation of understanding based on spiritual truth and exchanged them for physical, material truth. Essentially, man removed God and made himself God instead. That's what happened. And this is the time frame when evolutionary theory took root, and all across academic disciplines, people began trying to explain reality, intentionally trying to explain reality without God as an explanation. And obviously, when you try to separate God from truth and from reality, your plans are going to fail and be frustrated. The eventual end of modernism came about sometime in the 50s or 60s, whenever we crossed over into the period now known as postmodernism, which basically surmises, well, nobody can know what truth is then. Bright, intelligent minds for the past 200 or 300 years have tried every way that they can think of in their own finite minds to explain creation, to explain consciousness, to explain morality, to explain truth without deferring to the truth that the Creator has given us truth. It's an impossible task. We can't do it. Because they're starting from the false premise that truth doesn't come from God. You can't explain the reality that God has created without the truth that God has given us, namely that He exists. The best thing that humanity could come up with after 2 or 3 centuries of studying and thinking and debating was, well, we can't know anything for sure, I guess. That's where it ended. Now, obviously, the enemy has used this to his advantage by making sure that people don't follow this train of thought all the way to its end. They stop somewhere along the way. They accept, well, yep, you're right, God doesn't exist. We can explain some things and we can know some things. Evolution must be true. Maybe even that what is true for them doesn't have to be true for other people, right? But if you actually follow that postmodern logic all the way to its end, there's no other option than to admit at the end of all human reasoning is that reason can't exist at all. Truth can't exist. That's the only end that you can come to with that line of thinking. And that's actually why so many philosophers who have tried to explain the meaning of life through a lens of rationalism and postmodernism have ended up depressed, insane, committed suicide, because they've come to that reality, not being willing to accept God's truth, that the only other option is insanity. That is the only end to that train of thought. So have you ever seen artwork that looks like it was finger painted by a 3-year-old, and you read the article and it says it's selling for millions of dollars, and you're like, what is happening? Why? I feel like that's kind of a picture of postmodern thought, because you have people saying things like, the only true wisdom is knowing that you can't know anything. Right? And then you got a whole bunch of other people literally worshiping them and hailing these people as some sort of genius. And I'm like, it's like my 3-year-old finger painted something that's being sold for millions of dollars. I don't get it. I don't understand it. But I found this graphic. I didn't make it, but I thought it really explained these 3 different categories of thought. And you have them on your sheets, but just since we're recording this, I wanted to do it up here on the board too. So the dot represents the pre-modern thought, right? Because God put it there, that's the way it's always been. Makes sense. The second, the arrow pointing up, that represents modern thought, right? We're just going to keep going onwards and upwards with inevitable progress until we know everything, which doesn't work. The third one is postmodern thought. Basically, it's just insanity. And that's unfortunately where our world is today. But here's the issue that we face. Most people don't think about the full consequences of the beliefs that they embrace, like I've already said. Most people don't take the logic the whole way through to the end of where that train of thought would take us. Especially in our current age, there's so many people that they just want a 10-second soundbite. They just want some kind of witty quip or meme online. They just want somebody else to figure it out for them and tell them what they need to do and what it is. They don't want to think for themselves. Both the rationalism of modern thought and the relativism of postmodern thought are alive and well in hearts and minds of people today. Whenever you understand the process of thoughts, you can begin to analyze and see, and whenever you hear people talk, you can know, oh, this is where that thought, this is where that philosophy actually came from. And so tonight I want to deal with the objections that rationalism and relativism, people that believe these philosophical thoughts, pose to Christian theistic truth. I also want to address attacks against the intelligence of those of us that adhere to a biblical worldview. So a rationalist might make statements such as, and maybe you've heard some of these, the universe came into existence with a big bang, and humans evolved over millions of years. That's rationalistic thinking. Given enough time, science will discover and be able to explain everything in nature. It's a rationalistic thought. Trust in God is blind faith. I trust in science and facts. How many times did we hear that over from 2020 to 2023? So you'll hear me say this a lot of times over the next several weeks, but a lot of the times, the best way to defend our Christian belief is to ask questions that force the person or people with the objection to analyze their own beliefs before we actually even defend what it is that they're attacking us for. Because many people, as I said, they don't consider the full consequence of the things even that they are saying that they believe. And if you can get them to analyze their own belief system genuinely, as I've mentioned, a lot of times they'll be confronted with the fact that their belief system is actually incomplete or faulty. We can't have an expectation, obviously, that we're going to convert every single person in one conversation. But my prayer is, hopefully your prayer is, that they would see the truth. You know, like we're told, one plants, another waters, God brings the growth. And we continue to pray for them to see the truth, that the biblical worldview, at the very least, is a more reasonable lens in which to view our reality in our world than whatever it is that they believe. We'll deal specifically with objections to science in the Bible in week 6, I think. So our conversation tonight specifically revolves around defending truth in general and not getting too hung up on specific details that science would pose. So we'll spend some more time responding to postmodernism or relativism because that impacts more of the thinking that's around us today in a much greater way than any of these others. But I think it's important to understand modernism as the precursor to the mainstream philosophy of today, and wanted to give you a few thoughts about handling that before we move on. So if someone says to you in one way or another that they trust hard evidence more than they trust spirituality or religion, here's some things that you can do to try to steer the conversation. Ask them what the point of science and exploration is. Typically, for a rationalist, the point is simply progress. We want to leave the world in a better place than we found it. A person with this belief system will most likely say also that people are inherently good, and in general, progress in society is the goal. All work together, we're going to have a better outcome. You can ask them, well, who defines progress? Right? They might genuinely believe that each surpassing generation has enjoyed a better life. I have talked to people that believe this. Every generation that we can think of and analyze has enjoyed a better life than the one has come before it. Or at the very least, we're in a better place today than we were 1,000 years ago. Even if we have a little bit of ups and downs, the overall curve is going up. I think that we could point out, though, that nearly every new development, whether it's a new medical discovery or whether it's a new technological advancement, whatever it might be, although we have provided a lot of benefits, there's also been a lot of problems that we've caused. So ask them if they can honestly look back through history and claim for sure that we have progressed. For sure, are we better off now than we were 100 years ago? Are we better off now than we were 500 or 1,000 years ago? Who determines that we're in a better place? Because I think there's a lot of arguments to be made that we're actually not. So who determines if we've been successful? I mean, we still have wars, we still have crime, there's still racism, there's still addictions. Suicide rates actually now are way higher than they were, even 10 years ago, right? So is that progress in our society, in our world? I don't know if we can say without a doubt that it is necessarily. Circumstances, conveniences, and comforts, certainly, they've changed, they've improved, but I don't know if we can say without a doubt that we've actually made any real substantial progress. Furthermore, if someone claims to only believe in things that they can see and touch, this would be called materialism. A lot of times, rationalists are also materialists. They just reject anything that has anything to do with the spiritual world at all. So if they were a materialist and only believe in things that they can see and touch, if they're consistent with that belief, then you can't believe in things like love or gravity, right? We can't see them, but we know that those things exist. So a lot of times just simply pointing out something like that that's so obvious that no one's going to argue about if gravity or love exists, well, then how do we know these other spiritual things that we can't see don't exist, right? And a lot of times you can get somewhere in that conversation. And these things are clearly a part of our reality. They're truth, but they're not necessarily testable. You can't pick it up, you can't feel it, you can't see it. And it doesn't fit very well, again, into their narrative of accepting only objective truths that you can study, that you can look at, that you can pick up and feel. So realizing that these intangible elements of life were difficult, if not impossible to explain, in addition to observing continued worldwide atrocities despite large-scale industrialization and advancements in the very field that modernists had put their faith into, is exactly what caused a lot of them to move on to new thoughts on how to explain reality. Basically, there are still some people that believe this way, but in general, the philosophy of thought has moved on from that because they saw that it didn't work. And so this new philosophy of thinking is called postmodernism. It's the mess. Think of it like this. So pre-modernism viewed the spiritual world as more real than the natural world. Modernism viewed the natural world as true and the spiritual world as superstition. They weren't sure about it. Postmodernism teaches that both the spiritual world and the natural world are essentially superstition. Think about, the different people, maybe you've encountered them to say, maybe we are actually living in the Matrix. Like maybe you don't even exist. I'm not sure. Who can know? I've met people that actually think this way. And this is what leads us to, I'm sure that you've all heard this phrase, what's true for you might not be true for me. That is relativism. No one can know for sure anything at all. And so I think that's the statement that we hear most often from people who have embraced that philosophy, or something along those lines, right? And this reminds me of the line that's repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's exactly what we have today. Now, it's kind of, I understand it's a little bit snarky, so maybe you don't feel comfortable with it, but it's a great comeback to somebody that says something along the lines of everyone's entitled to their own truth. Just simply ask them, is that statement true for everyone? It can't be. Point out the paradox right there. We can't all be operating under our own truth. It doesn't work that way. But basically, the underlying thought process is that no one can know anything with absolute certainty. Everything's open to personal interpretation, so everyone should accept that we are all on our own journey for truth, or whatever, our truth might be, and we all have to respect each other's journeys, right? Because again, if you follow this statement to its logical end, we're all going to arrive at insanity. And we can't even be sure, again, that we even exist, or that you even exist, or anything exists at all. So in actuality, the statement, what's true for you might not be true for me, can really only be applied to opinion and not to facts, not to truth. Because if you ask the same person what 2 + 2 is, they'll almost undoubtedly answer 4. Why? Because it's the same for it's true. It's a truth. It's the same for everyone, no matter where you are, all the time. It always equals 4. If you ask them to go up to a building and drop their phone off of it, are they going to do it? Probably not, because we know what's going to happen. It's going to fall to the ground, it's going to smash. Doesn't matter what building you go up to, doesn't matter what city you're in, that's the way that it's going to be, because it's true for everyone, all the time. That's what truth is, not opinion. So if pressed, most people, not all of them, but most people will backtrack a little bit on their original statement, and they'll concede that what they really meant was that no one can be certain about spiritual truths or moral issues, what they mean is no one can be sure if they're going to heaven or if there even really is a heaven or if there is a God, all of these other things that you can't test in a material sense. What's true for you might not be true for me from a metaphysical, from a spiritual sense, but we're not talking about, mathematical laws or things that we can actually test and see. So you can't be certain that God exists is really their main point. You can't prove that it was the Holy Spirit who healed you. You can't prove that sin exists or that there's any consequence to sin. All of these other things is really what they want to get at. But sometimes they haven't even actually analyzed that really is what they have a problem with. So even if everything that we believe as a Christian does turn out to be true, they will say, well, we can't say that Islam or Buddhism or any other religion isn't also true. Like, we don't know that. Essentially, in the mind of someone that has these beliefs, arguing about spiritual truths will yield the same results as arguing over which flavor of ice cream is the best, because it's all rooted in opinion, personal preference. So how do you respond to those types of things? Or how do we respond internally when the enemy tries to convince us that we're deceived of our own faith, right? I've had and ministered to a lot of people that are just having a season where the enemy's really coming at them, and it's like, man, well, I don't even know. How did I get here? Why do I believe all of these things that the Bible tells me? So first of all, we have to start with logic. The idea that Christianity could be true, but Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, or any of the other isms out there could be equally true, again, doesn't work. That's personal preference, that's opinion. Christianity claims that there's only one way to heaven. Jesus claimed that he was the only way to the Father, right? That's a truth claim. So if Christianity claims that there's only one way, and that's a core belief of Christianity, if that statement is true, then all of these other ones can't be. You can't have two contradicting truths. It doesn't work that way. Even though some people would like to convince us, the enemy would like to convince us that maybe it is true. Typically, if you can get to that point in a conversation, then you'll hear something along the lines of, well, you Christians, you're so arrogant, right? You think that your way is the only way. I just don't agree with it. You're so intolerant. Do you really think that Christians, you think that you're the only ones that understand truth, right? Yes, correct. That's where we've arrived at this conversation. If you profess to be a Christian, then you're making a claim about truth. Not some truth that we made up based on emotion or personal opinion, but truth given to us by God, given to us by the Creator, and backed up actually with a whole lot of evidence. So if you believe Christianity is true, then you are also by default making the statement that every other worldview and every other belief system is not true. We can't find a middle ground to where we can say, well, yeah, we'll all be there one day. Just be genuine to whatever you believe. Jesus is the only way, or he's not the only way. Christianity says he is the only way. And some people try to fabricate that gray area, right? There's a lot of people actually that try to fabricate that gray area and even put Jesus' name on it. That's idolatry. That is making a God in our own image. And the Bible has a lot to say about that as well. We believe that there is a right and a wrong, that there is an acceptable and an unacceptable, that there is truth and that there are lies. Because we all live in the world that God designed and created, we have to abide by God's rules, whether we acknowledge his existence or not, right? People who say there is no way to know spiritual truth can't actually live that out. Even by making the statement, we can't know for sure, they're making a claim about truth. That's why when you're trying to point out, you can ask them the question, is that statement true for everyone? Because they are making a claim about truth that isn't true. And if we can't know for sure that God exists or that Jesus is the only way, how does someone determine where to draw any other line in life? So we can ask them something along the lines of, well, should Hitler have been able to carry out his plan for world domination since he was just reacting to his truth? Or what if your neighbor, right? What if your neighbor wants your car, wants your house, and he believes, it's his truth, that it's perfectly okay to take it by force? Since that's true, or since that's his truth, does that make it okay? How do you draw the line? Again, questions are great. Pointing these things out, how do you draw the line to where your truth can conflict with mine, or, and again, this is why we end up in insanity. But here's the reality. People will typically say, they'll start talking about laws, or they'll say that, well, one person's truth can encroach on another person's well-being, and they'll try to make these excuses, but all of these excuses are really just smoke and mirrors, right? The enemy's created all of these things. They just regurgitate these responses so that they don't have to deal with where that train of thought would actually take them. Because again, it's all rooted in, I don't want to say that God is true. That's what they're trying to avoid. But the reality of this life is that there is truth. Truth is logical, and it can be always carried out to the end of extremes. Like, if it's truly okay to make up my own truth, then we have to respect every truth that someone makes up, including Hitler or a greedy neighbor. Otherwise, we have no way of drawing the lines between any of those things. Truth can't be relative to an individual because no one lives as an isolated individual. That's not the world that we live in. Even the guy on the deserted island, right? He has to deal with truths. Laws of nature, like gravity, like math. We don't just get to draw a line between scientific truths and spiritual truths. The truth of the world that God created is true for all of us, no matter where we are. And God has revealed himself to his creation. And although, again, he hasn't revealed everything, and maybe even not everything that we wish that he had, he's given us a wealth of truth that we can stand on firmly. And so when you analyze reality, the reality of the world that we live in, if we're being honest, against every other worldview that humans have devised, the Christian worldview is by far, at the very least, the most reasonable. Even if we can't say it's 100% true without a doubt, we have to be able to say, well, it's the most reasonable way of viewing the world, more so than any other thing that people have come up with. So no matter how much a person would like to escape the truth, as I've said a couple times now, they can't, because God created a world where truth exists, where black and white exists. And so the best that people who want to remove God from their thought process can do is basically just pretend that he doesn't exist by making up all of these other excuses. But as we well know, pretending that something doesn't exist doesn't actually make it not exist. So there's also a lot of people who are completely comfortable being and remaining ignorant, and want to continue pretending in a reality that clearly doesn't exist. I mean, we don't have to look very far in our world today to see repercussions of people who are make-believing their own reality, right? And they're completely comfortable with continuing to make believe their own reality, even when it's pointed out to them, which is actually really sad. So again, we're not going to be able to convince every person, but by asking questions like some of the ones that I presented here, hopefully you can get a person to at least think more deeply about why they say what they believe. Because a lot of people are just believing the things that have been passed down through philosophical thought, and might not even actually know why they've come to the thinking that they've come to. So a lot of times, though, this will be the third point here tonight, when you start asking those questions and poking holes in someone's belief, I mean, obviously we pray that they can see the truth and that we have this incredible breakthrough, and we invite them to church and they come that week and God sets them on fire. That's obviously the result that we hope for. But a lot of times, actually in my still somewhat limited experience, most of the time what happens whenever you start poking holes in someone's belief system, no matter how lovingly you do it, they get filled with offense and start calling names. That's usually where the conversation goes pretty quickly, because they don't have any truth to actually stand on. And so whenever you remove that foundation, or whenever they realize that there was no foundation to begin with, they deflect by calling names. And usually, again, from my experience, they come at our intelligence. As Christians, that seems to be the first thing that they attack. I've heard personally these and seen and heard many other people get something similar as well. Only uneducated people would believe in a sky daddy. I've had that one several times. Or, insert some other blasphemous name for God. You're not even worth my time if you actually believe in all of those ancient myths or fairy tales. Why are you fighting so hard against human progress? Remember where this one comes from. Why are you fighting so hard against human progress and still believing in childhood fairy tales? I've had people ask me, do you still believe in Santa Claus? Do you still believe in the Easter Bunny? Well, I believe in God. That's their train of thought. So let me give you an illustration real quick before making my next point. Imagine a mom and a dad, right? We'll call them Norman and Gertrude, all right? I don't know how far in the past Norman and Gertrude existed, but so they bake chocolate chip cookies for Christmas with their young kids, right? Norman, Gert, they walk their kids through the process of measuring out the flour, all the other ingredients. They teach them how to break the eggs, smooth out the clumps. They have the kids stir in. It's this whole family affair over Christmas, all right? And they make sure that, little Timmy and Sally, they know how to turn the oven on, set the timer, make sure their cookies come out perfect. And so baking these cookies every year for Christmas becomes a family tradition. We all have family traditions, right? Eventually, their kids, Timmy and Sally, they're grown. They have kids of their own. And their kids have kids, and their kids have kids. And several generations later, Norman and Gertrude's chocolate chip cookie recipe is still an annual tradition, even though they've been gone for generations, right? And one of their great-great-grandkids gets invited to a Christmas party with some friends, and so he makes a batch of Grandma Gert's chocolate chip cookies to take as a gift, right? And so by this point in time, Gert and Norm's names have long been forgotten. This kid doesn't even know where this recipe came from, but it's still living on through their family line. So this kid, he arrives at a party. He hands the cookies to the host of the party, and they eat a couple right away, and they make the comment, "Wow, can I get this recipe? These taste like they came straight out of Grandma's kitchen. They're amazing." And this little punk kid scoffs at them, and he says, "I made these all by myself. I put in a little of this, a little of that. It doesn't even matter what I throw into the bowl because everything I touch turns to gold. Grandma's got nothing on me," this kid says. That's how our modern academic system talks about God. Colleges, universities, high schools, that's essentially the illustration that has played out. We live in a country where our educational instruction, from kindergarten all the way up through doctoral degrees, claims that they are the source of all accumulated knowledge. That's their claim. People learned it. People did it. People explored it and investigated it. They claim that whether or not God exists, it's really irrelevant whenever we're dealing with the search for truth. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't really matter because we got this. The fact is, the entire concept of higher learning institution came from Christians seeking God. You wouldn't know it to look at the landscape of colleges and universities today, but they were specifically created by Christians as Christian learning institutions. Harvard, Stanford, MIT, University of Cambridge, Columbia, Princeton, Cal, UPenn, Yale, all of them started out as Christian universities founded by Christians to explore God. That was the point. And even before all of those American institutions that I listed, you have European institutions, Oxford, Bologna, Paris. They were all started around 1000 AD. The University of Bologna, I think I'm saying that correctly, I don't know, is acknowledged as the oldest university in the world. And they were all created as Christian schools. Now, a lot of times when you say a Christian school now, we would get this picture. It's not like what we would typically think of a Christian school now. Like a Christian university still has a lot of secular influence. Like these schools were specifically and only started with the purpose of studying God. That was it. Because back then, the prevailing pre-modern secular thinking was basically like this. The material world doesn't really matter, and the things that we experience through nature, they're just a byproduct of the emotions of all of the gods anyway. Like if Zeus gets angry, he might hit us with a hurricane. So as long as we're appeasing Zeus, then we don't have to deal with all of their chaotic wrath. Also, it was common to have a large divide between royalty and peasants. So the only thing that the peasants really needed to know was, how do I work? So based on all of the secular aspects of society, there was really no reason to pursue education. The poor people couldn't afford it, and they weren't going to get anywhere anyway. And just the prevailing thought was, why would we study, Nate? Why would we study anything? What are you doing those experiments on? The gods control all of that stuff. And who knows what they're going to feel like tomorrow? There was no reason to study. But Christians didn't have that same perspective on reality. They believed that the spiritual world mattered, but they also believed that the natural world mattered. They actually believed that by studying God's creation, that we were, in a sense, studying God. That we could, in a sense, learn more about him and grow closer to him. That was the whole motivation for the educational system. They believed that our God was purposeful, that he was orderly, that he was not like the volatile and emotional Greek gods or Roman gods. They believed that God gave us math and gave us logic and gave us reason for a reason, right? And that by studying all of these things, we would gain a greater revelation of how awesome God is and how awesome his creation really is. And Christians believed also, contrary to the thinking of the time, Christians believed that every person had innate value and deserved an opportunity to pursue and develop whatever their God-given skills and abilities were. Again, completely contradictory to everything that was happening in the world at that time. So many of these ambitious academics clung to Jesus' words in Matthew 22:37. And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." They believed that exploring, experimenting, and learning about the natural world actually glorified God. And they believed that this is what was meant by loving God with all of their minds. You can look at some of their writings. To love God with their minds meant that they were going to actually pursue developing their minds and also researching and learning more about the things that God had created. So because that was their thought process, they created schools where all of those pursuits became possible. And the scholars who attended these prestigious schools of learning had the same heart posture as the famous mathematician and astronomer Johann Kepler. Kepler once said, "I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else, the glory of God." Wouldn't it be incredible to have professors in our universities saying things like that? There was a time when they did. And there's plenty of research available on this topic, like I said, if you want to dig deeper. But there have been more scientific, medical, and technological discoveries and inventions made by Christian scientists, Christian doctors, and Christian engineers who were seeking God in the same way than by far, any other religion, including atheism or humanism. And remember, we're kind of addressing the criticisms from people that only uneducated people are Christian, basically. So consider this. There was a Jewish geneticist who had a fascination with statistics. And he studied the Nobel Prize winners from 1901 to 2001. So over the course of 100 years, 700 different Nobel Prize winners, the brightest minds, obviously, who made the biggest impacts on chemistry, physics, medicine, peace, literature, and economics. 65% of the winners were Christians. You want to guess what the second closest was? Jewish people, 21%. So 86% of Nobel Prizes went to the people who are glorifying God in their studies. Just for the sake of the numbers, 10% were atheist or agnostic, and the other 4% were made up of all of the other world religions. So just as a side note, the fact that 21% of Nobel winners were Jewish is actually absolutely astounding. Jewish people, in a large degree, because of the persecution that they faced over the centuries, they only account for 0.2% of the world's population. 0.2% of the world's population and 21% of Nobel Prize winners. That's pretty incredible. But again, God has blessed the nation of Israel, right? And that's why we're called to as well. But the point is this. We wouldn't have computers. We wouldn't have vehicles. We wouldn't have x-ray machines or radios or glasses or thousands of other things if it weren't for the people of God seeking after God. The list of inventions from Christian scientists and inventors is incredibly, incredibly long. And they were all developed from people simply pursuing God and thinking that their pursuit of education was glorifying to the God that had given them those motivations and those skills and abilities. So, the point being, it's extremely ignorant of anyone to say that the Christian worldview and academic pursuit are conflicting forces. It's actually quite the opposite. Academic breakthrough was only even achievable for humanity by first seeking after God and attempting to learn of his creation with his word as a guide. And again, we've got so far off track to where you wouldn't probably even know that that's why our colleges and universities were started, because God has almost been completely removed from them. And like I said, it is like that punk kid saying, well, no, we've done all of this. We've built all of this. Look at what humanity has done. But actually, there wouldn't even be a college or university system had it not been started on the foundation of people pursuing God. So I took my family, we went down to Sight and Sound yesterday. We watched Noah. It's an absolutely incredible production. If you've never gone down there, you definitely should. But their depiction of the rest of the world being locked outside as the flood engulfed the ark was pretty powerful. And obviously they take some creative liberties in the storyline. But they imagined the scene where Noah's sons and their wives were beating themselves up over the fact that they weren't able to convince their family and friends to believe before it was too late. And they were listening to them pound and everything on the outside of the boat, right? In that scene, they consoled each other, acknowledging that their job was just to share the truth, and that's what they had done. And then it was God's responsibility to move on the people who they had shared the truth with. That's what our job is, right? To share the truth. Even if it might be uncomfortable, I pray that as we work through this Apologetics series, that our faith would be bolstered internally, and that internal rising of our faith would result in a greater boldness to share the truth, because that's what God has asked us to do. Share the truth about Jesus, share it with our friends, with our family, with anybody else that God puts in our path. We have to share it with love, obviously, not with condemnation. And we can ask questions and make sure people know that we care about them having the right view of life. We care about them having the right view of truth. We're not just gloating about how we have truth and they don't. We actually want them to come into a revelation of God and his truth and the reality that a lot of people just ignore for one reason or another.